In January 1999, Zev Love X re-emerged as MF Doom. Welcome to the Book of Doom, a year-long series going through the life and times of hip-hop's greatest supervillain, MF Doom. In this chapter, we'll be going through the album that brought us the villain in his most well-known form, Operation Doomsday. Be sure to check out the previous chapters as well to have a more complete idea of Doom's life up until this point. Up until this time in Doom's life, he had formed KMD with his brother DJ Subroc in 1988. Shortly after, in 1991, KMD released their debut project, Mr. Hood. A couple of years later, while finishing up their second project, Black Bastards, DJ Subroc was killed in an accident. Unfortunately, also around this time, the label dropped KMD, shelving Black Bastards until 2001. In the meantime, Doom was essentially homeless, recovering from his wounds and swearing revenge against the industry that so badly deformed him. In the years leading up to the release of Operation Doomsday, he would often attend open mic nights at the Nuyorican Poets Cafe in Manhattan. He'd attend these events incognito by covering his face with tights. You can almost think of this as a precursor to the mask that we would eventually all recognize him for. Also during this time, we got a handful of singles for the project with Deadbent, Gas Draws, Hey, Greenbacks, Go With The Flow, The MIC, and Red and Gold. Most of which I feel were unheard of in their original form, which was just on vinyl, at least until the reissue of Operation Doomsday in 2011. Eventually, in January 1999, we finally saw the reemergence of the supervillain MF Doom with the release of Operation Doomsday, which received critical acclaim. As good of an introduction to Doom as this project is, it must also be noted that this project sounds very little like his future works. Sure, we get similar sounds in terms of samples and production, but here the villain really tapped into early superhero cartoons for inspiration. Back then, we'd often see villains as an easy obstacle to overcome for the heroes, and the heroes weren't necessarily these all-powerful beings, but more like regular people. Aside from the skits that we get throughout the album to reinforce the Dr. Doom inspiration, we also get a nod to it with the line, "Fed up from fighting secret wars with them Fantastic Four," from the track Gas Draws. This album carries the mindset of old superhero cartoons well by keeping things a little more lighthearted and playful than we would see in his future releases. The lighthearted nature of this album isn't a bad thing though, and actually it allows it to serve as a great introduction to Doom. In fact, whenever people ask where they should start when listening to Doom, Operation Doomsday is one of my first suggestions. This is because, to me, it's the most accessible album for the majority of people. The production and sampling doesn't get as, I guess you could say, weird as we start to see later on in his career, and it's just overall a little less out there, with the exception of our introduction to King Ghidorah.
King Ghidorah?
Another reason why this album is a good introduction to Doom is because we almost immediately get a taste of his sampling and production style with the first track, The Time We Faced Doom.
Why don't you tell him about the time we faced Doom?
All right.
This track is really just snippets of old cartoons and movies, just kind of thrown together to create a dialogue. The primary source of the dialogue here and throughout much of the album is from the 1960s Fantastic Four show. This is fitting though, given Doom's apparent inspiration being Dr. Doom. With this project, the similarities to Dr. Doom mostly lie in their apparent quest for world domination, which is pretty evident given the title of the album. Through the skits on this project, we hear of the birth of Doom, and that could be thought of as inspiration for Doom to take on the name Doom. Doom's goal wasn't necessarily to conquer the world though, but instead to conquer the rap game. Because if you remember, he wanted revenge against the industry that so badly deformed him. In years prior with KMD, he and Subroc really aspired to educate listeners about things that are going on with them, but also in hoods and ghettos all over the world. They wanted to show everyone the inequalities and mistreatment of black and brown people. Doom swearing his revenge makes sense, because at this time, KMD's second album still had not been released, which was almost entirely due to the fact that the cover art depicted their Sambo character being hung via a game of hangman. The industry pushed him and his aspirations aside, but that's what ultimately led to the artist that we all know and love. Doom let the listeners know of his intent with the first song on this project, Doomsday, where early in his first verse he says,
destroy rap. It's an intricate plot of a b-boy strap.
He's let everyone know from the jump that he's here to destroy and conquer, and that this doomsday will be coming at you from a b-boy strapped. He provides further reasoning for why he's doing this with the chorus. On doomsday, ever since the womb till I'm back where my brother went, that's what my tomb will say. Read it by my government doomlay, either unmarked or engraved, hey, who's to say? A lot of what Doom does is in memory of his brother Subroc, especially on this album. So having this in the first song of the album was, I can imagine, pretty important to him. He carries on the memory of his brother with one of the final tracks on the album, Questions. Here he spends the majority of his last verse talking about Subroc and the memories of him with, like my twin brother, we did everything together, from 100 rakat salats to cob and butter leathers. Remember when you went and got the dark blue ballies? I had all the different colored gazelles and gazelles. The Subroc 3-finger ring with the ruby on the O-Ak. Truly the illest dynamic duo on the whole block. I keep a flick of you with the machete sword in your hand. Everything is going according to plan, man. Alongside the introduction to Doom, we are also introduced to a handful of other artists that Doom would collaborate with, at least for a short time. All of whom are all part of the Monster Island Czars. The Monster Island Czars was essentially a group comprised of New York artists, but instead of using their actual names, they'd use monster names that were based on Godzilla universe characters such as King Ghidorah, Jet Jaguar, Grimlock, Monster X, and many more. Their inclusion and use of monster names, though, wasn't as prevalent as what Doom would do. However, we will discuss them as well as Doom's work with MF Grimm at a later time. The main reason to bring them up at all here is that with this album, we get our first introduction to one of Doom's alter egos. Up until now, we were just under the impression that Zev simply changed his name to MF Doom, and that's that. Artists change their name all the time, so that's not too weird. But, it's not too much of a stretch for artists to have like a different name for a different sort of style project, especially if it doesn't quite mesh with their typical style. However, Doom took it a step further, I feel, and literally created a new persona for himself. Like, Ghidorah is just a whole nother creature entirely. And the same thing goes for like Victor Vaughn. Like, that's a completely different character from the Doom character. What's even more interesting is that King Ghidorah is nothing like any of his other alter egos, because it's literally a monster. Like, the way he explained it was King Ghidorah lives on another planet or another universe or somewhere in our universe, and basically what's happening is that he's sending these rhymes via transmission.
Ghidra's an interesting character. You know what I mean? The whole direction of Ghidra is like, okay, he's not even from the Earth, you know what I'm saying? He's from outer space, and he channels the information to Doom in order for Doom to produce and whatnot. So Doom is he gets the message from Ghidra.
What's not clear is if Doom just happens to understand what Ghidorah is saying, or if all the transmissions are being translated by Ghidorah himself, because every time you hear Ghidorah or see Ghidorah featured on a track, it's just screeching. But you can kind of think of it, in my mind at least, as Doom being the ventriloquist dummy and Ghidorah being the ventriloquist. Doom is just the voice for what Ghidorah is saying. There are many memorable moments on this album, and honestly, there's nothing that should be skipped with it. I know back when I first started listening to Doom, I had only listened to a handful of songs off of this project because they were just easier to throw on and just put into a playlist. However, after returning to it over the years, it's wildly impressive how Doom was able to stuff every track with so many bars. He really returned to the rap game to show everyone that he wasn't messing around. From fun tracks like Rhymes Like Dimes to conceptual ones like the MIC to the introspective and heartfelt question mark song. Doom really does give listeners a lot to digest and process with Operation Doomsday. This album definitely ranks highly for me in terms of Doom's discography, mostly due to the history surrounding it. The re-emergence of Zev Love X as MF Doom after the death of his brother and removal from the label is an underdog story that many would feel for. With this tape, we get a taste of what's to come with MF Doom, with his future releases and other alter egos. Let me know what you thought of this album if you listened to it. If you haven't, I urge you to check it out because it's one of the best ways to get acquainted with Doom as a person and an artist. This album does what much of his future works do not. And what that is really put on display a bit of Doom's personal life. We may get bits and pieces of it with his other projects, but at that point in his career, he's fully enveloped in the character of Doom, or Victor Von, or King Ghidorah, and we don't really hear much about Daniel Dumoulin. Here, his wounds are still fresh, and he's showing us what he's truly capable of. That concludes Chapter 3 of the Book of Doom. Please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter where I'll be discussing his collaborative project with MF Grimm and more. Also, let me know what you thought of this video in the comments below. And if you've listened to this project, let me know what your thoughts on it are, especially if you listened to it when it was first released. I'd love to hear what people thought of it when it was first coming out and being rolled out. With that said, thank you for watching, and please stay safe out there.